Good evening, everyone. My name is Melissa Page Nichols, and I am pastoral counselor with the Office of Campus Ministry here at King's University College. And on behalf of myself and the Office of Campus Ministry and King's College, we're delighted to welcome you here this evening. If you have not yet been able to attend an event here in our Joanne and Peter Kenny Theater of the new Darrell J. King Student Life Center. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce to you this evening's lecturer, Professor Margaret Pfeil. Professor Pfeil received both a PhD in moral theology, Christian ethics in 2000 from the University of Notre Dame and an MTS in moral theology with distinction from Weston Jesuit School of Theology in 1994. Dr. Pfeil holds a joint appointment in the theology department and in the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. She is a faculty fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Her research interests include Catholic social thought, racial justice, ecological ethics, liberation theology, ecumenical dialogue, and peace studies. Dr. Pfeil was awarded with the Grenville Clark Award in May 2012 in recognition of her outstanding service in the community. With Tobias Winwright, she co-edited Violence, Transformation, and the Sacred. They Shall Be Called Children of God. With Gerald Schalbuck, she is co-editor of Sharing Peace, Mennonites and Catholics in Conversation. And with Lori Cassidy and Alex Mikulik, she is co-author of The Scandal of White Complicity in U.S. Hyper-Incarceration, a Nonviolent Spirituality of White Resistance. Dr. Pfeil is a co-founder and resident of the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker Community in South Bend, Indiana, now in its 10th year. There are 2 houses of hospitality welcoming men and women in need of housing, to share space with 11 volunteer staff members, of which Dr. Pfeil is one. Also in connection with this community is a day center, Our Lady of the Road, where people in need can receive a meal and have access to both shower and laundry facilities. From November to April each year, the community hosts 10 additional men overnight at Our Lady of the Road as part of a weather amnesty program in concert with 4 other agencies in South Bend. After one of Canada's most extreme winters recorded in over 30 years, I think we can all appreciate what a critical resource this kind of hospitality community is for people dealing with homelessness. So now, to speak to the topic of food, justice, and the integrity of creation, please join me in welcoming Dr. Margaret Pfeil.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out in the cold. It's a delight to be here with you. And thanks so much to Melissa for arranging all the details of my visit, and to all here at King's for your generous hospitality. As Melissa mentioned, I'm part of a Catholic worker community in South Bend, Indiana, and my academic work in the links between food, justice, liturgy, and creation have grown very organically out of my daily life with folks on our streets in South Bend. Even though we live in America's breadbasket, surrounded by farmland, low-income people in the city, and particularly people of color, struggle to find healthy, affordable food and to create the necessary structures to ensure full, active participation of all members of society in building a sustainable food system. So I come at this from the experiential level into the theoretical and then back again. Tonight, I'd like to use the U.S. Bishop's 1986 pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, as a conversation partner to explore the value of a cooperative approach to economic justice in addressing the interrelationship of food, justice, and the integrity of creation. In this pastoral letter, the U.S. bishops emphasize the concept of justice understood as participation of all members of society in service of the common good. Cooperative economic practices, they suggested, exemplify justice as participation. Since that time, the imperiled state of the world's ecosystems has generated increasing concern about local food systems, representing an urgent issue of justice at the present time, and sparking new questions about structures of participation that would fulfill the demands of justice. In a globalized industrial economy, food production and consumption practices have become dependent upon the capacity of large agricultural and food corporations to manufacture and ship goods around the world at the cheapest price, burning up scarce energy supplies and further threatening Earth's ecological integrity. At the same time, disparities of power have rendered healthy food relatively inaccessible in certain populations, resulting in disproportionate health risks for poor people of color in urban U.S. communities. The bishop's pastoral letter, together with scripture, liturgy, and other resources of the Christian tradition, offer a way to address these global food, energy, and ecological signs of the times in light of the demands of justice as participation. By understanding creation first and foremost as belonging to God, the Creator, humans may see ourselves as God's co-workers. This basic theological concept serves to ground cooperative economic practices in support of more localized food systems. Local food cooperatives bring together urban residents and regional growers as co-workers with one another and with God. As they forge relationships among themselves and with the land about them, they bear witness to the radical interdependence of God's creation, manifested so clearly in the interconnection among all living members of a particular ecosystem. Supporting the integrity or wholeness of God's creation through cooperative local food practices represents the work of justice as participation in service of the common good. In highlighting cooperative practices, the bishops draw from a deep wellspring in the Christian social tradition, beginning with Scripture. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 7-9, Paul addresses discord within the Corinthian church. He writes, "Therefore neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who causes the growth. The one who plants and the one who waters are equal, and each will receive wages in proportion to his labor. For we are God's co-workers. You are God's field, God's building," unquote. The original Greek word for the phrase God's co-workers is synergoi. So by emphasizing the value of cooperation, Economic Justice for All, the pastoral letter, invites readers, and particularly in this case U.S. Catholics, to discern how all might become synergoi, people who work cooperatively toward fuller economic participation, particularly of the poorest and most vulnerable. A very countercultural vision, both then and now. The bishops write, quote, "The biblical vision of creation has provided one of the most enduring legacies of church teaching. To stand before God as the Creator is to respect God's creation, both the world of nature and of human history. From the patristic period to the present, the Church has affirmed that misuse of the world's resources or appropriation of them by a minority of the world's population betrays the gift of creation, since whatever belongs to God belongs to all," unquote. The concept that God's creation belongs to all is known in Catholic social thought as the principle of the universal destination of created goods. It serves as a means to adjudicate questions of material possessions and advocate practices of economic sharing. In his 2009 encyclical letter, Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI used this principle to frame his appeal for a people-centered economic ethic, suggesting cooperatives as a promising practice. And in that process, he quoted from Populorum Progressio, Paul VI's encyclical on the development of peoples in 1967. And Populorum Progressio, in turn, was quoting St. Ambrose from the 4th century, who wrote, "You are not making a gift of your possessions to the poor person. You are handing over to him what is his. For what has been given in common for the use of all, you have arrogated to yourself. That is, private property does not constitute for anyone an absolute and unconditioned right. No one is justified in keeping for his exclusive use what he does not need when others lack necessities," unquote. Though the principle of the universal destination of created goods represents an important ethical criterion in Catholic social thought, the signs of the present time speak to its disregard. According to the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, the top 1% of the U.S. population received 17.1% of the nation's after-tax income, while the bottom fifth receives 4.9%. In 2011, the chief executive officers of the largest U.S. companies were compensated on average at a rate 508 times greater than the average U.S. worker. Globally, it is estimated that women perform 66% of the world's work, produce 50% of the food, but earn 10% of the income and own 1% of the property. Since the 2008 recession, Black householders in the U.S. have experienced the largest decline in median income of any racial or ethnic group, at 4.4%. Women across racial and ethnic groups continue to earn less than men, but the gap in median income is greatest for Black and Hispanic women. These data demonstrate the value of systemic analysis in discerning the requirements of justice, focusing attention on the dynamics of class, gender, and race to highlight economic power disparities. They also reveal the need for a more vigorous cultivation of cooperative economic practices in light of the Catholic social tradition's emphasis on the universal destination of created goods. Among these goods, the accessibility of food as a fruit of God's creation has become a central point of ethical concern, particularly in light of the trend toward industrialization of agriculture. Indian physicist Vandana Shiva sharply summarizes the current dilemma. Quote, "We are now facing a triple convergence of crises, each of which threatens our survival. First, climate. Global warming threatens our very survival as a species. And second, energy. Peak oil spells the end of cheap oil that has fueled the industrialization of production and the globalization of consumerism. Third, food. A food crisis is emerging as a result of the convergence of climate change, peak oil, and the impact of globalization on the rights of the poor to food and livelihood. Of the three crises," she writes, "the emerging food crisis poses the most immediate threat to the survival of the poor," unquote. The food crisis stems directly, she argues, from the long-term process of industrialization of agriculture and the more recent dynamics of globalization, including liberalization of agricultural trade policies. Shiva writes, 1 billion people are without food because industrial monocultures rob them of their livelihoods in agriculture and their food entitlements. Another 1.7 billion are suffering from obesity and food-related diseases. Monocultures lead to malnutrition for those who are underfed as well as those who are overfed. Farmers are being destroyed because prices of farm products are driven down through a combination of monopolistic buying by global corporations and dumping of subsidized products, unquote. These dynamics of climate, energy, and globalization of food production span the world, but have profound effects upon local communities precisely in their particularity. Moving toward localization of food economies, Shiva concludes, is an ethical imperative. The U.S. bishops may have anticipated her insight when they advocated cooperation of rural and urban interests in resolving the challenges and problems facing agriculture. Surprisingly, though, the bishops did not draw any explicit connection between the industrialization of agriculture and the reality of malnutrition as a mark of urban poverty, especially among the 1 in 4 children and 1 of every 2 black children under the age of 6 who were growing up in poverty in the U.S. at that time. The pastoral letter makes reference to food security only in global terms as a matter of agricultural trade policy. Though the bishops addressed the perduring problem of racism in U.S. society and in the farming economy specifically, they did not make a direct connection to food security in the manner that the current language of food justice connotes, that is, locating the need for food security, access to healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate food, in the context of institutionalized racism, racial formation, and racialized geographies. The West Oakland Food Collaborative, for example, is located in an area of Northern California with 1 grocery store serving about 40,000 residents, primarily low income and black. It seeks to foster relationships specifically between the urban black community and the region's black farmers. Based upon their ethnographic research, Allison Alcon and Carrie Norgard report that members of the collaborative attribute the historical decline of black farmers nationwide to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's denial of loans, subsidies, and other support that enabled white farmers to transition to mechanized agriculture. The sustainable agriculture movement, which ostensibly holds as one of its main goals the promotion of justice for those engaged in agriculture, has not considered the race-based systemic injustice visited upon black farmers and low-income urban residents. Instead, Mark Wynn reports, it has focused on the farmer's place, quote, his or her use of sustainable, if not organic, production methods, and the size of his or her farm. But the criterion of social justice is notably absent. One of its proponents acknowledged, quote, as a mostly white movement, we were largely blind to hunger, race, and class issues, unquote. By contrast, in conscious response to precisely these issues, the West Oakland Food Collaborative offers an important urban market venue for black farmers, while also addressing the systemic roots of the dearth of healthy, affordable food options in their own local community. As Alcon and Norgard note, with, quote, with nearly 1.5 times as many corner liquor stores as the city average, as well as an abundance of fast food establishments, West Oakland is typical of low-income African-American food deserts in other cities, unquote. Creating an alternative local food system that affords urban black residents access to healthy, locally grown food and provides black farmers with market space serves the end of food justice by transforming the structures of institutionalized racism and white supremacy. To the extent that the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, like the residents of West Oakland, find ready access to the basic goods required for human flourishing, it serves the end of the common good for the entire society. As the bishops stated in their pastoral letter, quote, from the scriptures and church teaching, we learn that the justice of a society is tested by its treatment of the poor, unquote. When some members of society experience deprivation of that which is necessary for their integral well-being, the common good of all suffers. Attending to right relationship as part of the adjudication of justice contributes to the restoration of the integrity or wholeness of God's creation. Since the economic justice pastoral, Catholic social teaching texts have given greater attention to the integrity of creation, reflecting a more holistic understanding of its radical interdependence. These treatments have typically come in response to evidence of significant degradation and abuse of ecosystems. Benedict XVI offered perhaps the most compelling account of the current ecological signs of the times and their ethical implications in his 2010 World Day of Peace message. He writes, "Can we remain indifferent before the problems associated with such realities as climate change, desertification, and the deterioration and loss of productivity in vast agricultural areas, the pollution of rivers and aquifers, the loss of biodiversity, the increase of natural catastrophes, and the deforestation of equatorial and tropical regions? Can we disregard the growing phenomenon of environmental refugees, people who are forced by the degradation of their natural habitat to forsake it, and often their possessions as well, in order to face the dangers and uncertainties of forced displacement? Can we remain impassive in the face of actual and potential conflicts involving access to natural resources? All these are issues with a profound impact on the exercise of human rights, such as the right to life, food, health, and development, unquote. For Benedict XVI, indifference, lack of regard, and passivity do not represent appropriate ethical responses to these limit situations because they would not serve the end of justice. If all aspects of creation stand in mutual relationship, as the intricate balance of ecosystems reveals to us, then violation of any one part disrupts the integrity of the whole. The emphasis on justice as participation in the economic justice pastoral represents a promising starting point for generating ethical actions of solidarity and restoration in the face of environmental degradation. But looking back on that 1986 pastoral letter, deeper connections among the themes of cooperation, food justice, and the radical interdependence of creation emerge. I suggest that a synthesis and further development of these concepts leads to reconsideration of the bishop's concept of justice as participation. A restorative model of justice rooted in right relationship, one that includes the value of participation, but also requires interrogation of the existing economic systems, would better ensure that participation does not inadvertently lead to perpetuation of injustice. To test this point, the example of the supermarket industry in the United States proves illuminating. Today, food security is not only a global concern, but a U.S. problem, particularly in food deserts, defined by the 2008 U.S. Farm Bill as, quote, an area in the U.S. with limited access to affordable and nutritious food, particularly such an area composed of predominantly lower-income neighborhoods and communities, unquote. One research study notes both median income and population density have a close relationship to the amount of supermarket capacity that can be found in a given community, with the former bearing a somewhat stronger correlation to the pattern of store locations than the latter. This finding is corroborated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service data, showing that low-income households in rural areas and poor central cities have less access to reasonably priced, high-quality food than other households. Furthermore, there is a direct correlation between lack of healthy, affordable food choices and the incidence of diet-related diseases, including obesity, diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, which disproportionately affect low-income Blacks and Latinos. These data have prompted one group of researchers to suggest that the term food swamp may be more appropriate than food desert, since the most pressing issue in U.S. urban settings is not insufficient access to food calories, but rather the inundation of low-income communities of color with unhealthy, energy-dense snack foods through corner quick marts. Even if low-income communities were successful in wooing supermarkets to their backyards, would that necessarily support a healthier diet or a more just economy? One could argue that by organizing effectively to bring about this outcome, a particular community would have enacted justice as participation. But viewed systemically, such an outcome might actually undermine the goal of food justice in that community due to the structure of the food economy. As a vendor in the West Oakland Food Collaborative bluntly put it, quote, I don't want Safeway or Albertsons. They abandoned the inner city. They sell poison. They pay lousy wages, unquote. A recent longitudinal study, in fact, has found that greater access to supermarkets generally does not lead to improved quality of diet. In the context of a holistic understanding of justice as right relationship, the pastoral letter's emphasis on justice as participation may be too narrow to address the systemic aspect of food security facing local communities around the world. Equity of participation alone does not satisfy the demands of justice when the economic system that structures participation has been fundamentally corrupted by gross disparities of power. Where food is concerned, the supermarket industry exemplifies what Wendell Berry calls the total economy, in which everything, quote, has a price and is for sale. In a total economy, significant and sometimes critical choices that once belonged to individuals or communities become the property of corporations. Two marks of the total economy are ignorance and vulnerability. Wendell Berry writes, "One does not know the history of the products that one uses. Where exactly did they come from? Who produced them? What toxins were used in their production? What were the human and ecological costs of producing them and then of disposing of them? Though one is shopping amid an astonishing variety of products, one is denied certain significant choices. In such a state of economic ignorance, it is not possible to choose products that were produced locally or with reasonable kindness toward people or toward nature. To be a consumer in a total economy, one must agree to be totally ignorant, totally passive, and totally dependent on distant supplies and self-interested suppliers." Unquote. Ignorant, passive, and dependent. These are just the sorts of responses that Benedict XVI's World Day of Peace message excluded as unethical in the face of the current ecological crisis and its implications. But Berry poignantly illustrates the pervasive systemic forces at work to ensure the future of industrial food production and consumption, prompting the question, what course of action would be ethically appropriate and possible? To elude the anesthetizing tentacles of the total economy, local initiatives like the West Oakland Food Collaborative seek to create an alternative food system that affords full participation directly toward the end of food justice. One person interviewed by Alkan and Norgard reflected, quote, "It's about building a community that takes care of each other's needs. And we can self-sustain outside of the dominant system. We want to buy and sell from each other in a way that helps us sustain our neighborhoods and our communities. That's different than consuming in a way that sustains a mega business that's separate and distinct from us," unquote. This is a great description of food sovereignty, an approach which emphasizes a community's self-organization and autonomy in relation to food. Active participation in the cultivation of an alternative food system directed toward food justice not only fosters relationships between local, urban residents and regional farmers, but also serves to remember, so re-member, the web of relationships connecting humans with the rest of God's creation. As humans have greater opportunity to practice conscious eating, remembering the farmer who grew the particularly luscious tomato, having perhaps helped her to till the land and bring the crop to the local urban farmers market, we may become more attuned to the sounds of distress in our local ecosystems. No longer is it just another video image on the nightly news of a collapsing ice shelf in the Antarctic or an apocalyptic statistic racing across the bottom of a muted screen in the airport. Now we become aware that the soil suffering erosion is right beneath our feet and under our fingernails. And the river being polluted courses like a vein through our city, sustaining or contaminating all life forms in and around it. No longer are we industrial eaters. Wendell Berry's term for, quote, one who does not know that eating is an agricultural act, who no longer knows or imagines the connections between eating and the land, unquote. Through cooperative work to bring about an alternative food system, we know we are inextricably related to the land and the humans who cultivated it, bound together with the other fruits of God's creation that sustain our lives. These connections between eating and the land carry further significance because eating is a sacramental act, and the land is the gift of God's creative abundance. In their letter, the bishops readily connected liturgy and justice through food. Quote, "From the Lord's command to feed the hungry to the Eucharist we celebrate as the bread of life, the fabric of our faith demands that we be creatively engaged in sharing the food that sustains life. There is no more basic human need," unquote. Jesus demonstrated the essential relationship among food, liturgy, and justice by eating and drinking his way through ministry, dining, forgiving, and healing, right up until the end, until his final meal with his disciples. They in turn followed his directive to remember him by commemorating the Last Supper in a liturgy of thanksgiving, the Eucharist. As Benedictine scholar Virgil Michael indicates, the act of offering as part of the Eucharistic liturgy is radically social. In ancient practice, each person would bring a gift as part of the communal offering of all, for all, including those present and absent, living and dead, to be shared with the poor in solidarity. These gifts represent the fruits of the worshipper's physical labor, exercised with intentionality. As synergoi, God's co-workers, they produced bread and wine from grain and grapes, the fruits of God's creation. Participants in the Christian liturgy of Eucharist recognize all of material creation as a sacrament of communion with God the Creator, receiving all creation as gift and offering it back to God through the dynamic, creative exercise of each person's vocation as one made in the image of God. In giving thanks, the human person becomes more fully herself or himself before God. In Eucharistic communion, God responds by giving God's own Son, Jesus Christ, as food to sustain God's people. By taking, eating, and drinking, as Jesus invited his disciples to do, Christians become Christ's body in the world, united with him and with one another, and ready to participate in the restoration of the integrity of God's creation. Alexander Schmemann, a Eastern Orthodox theologian, has observed that the original meaning of the Greek word liturgia referred to, quote, an action by which a group of people become something corporately which they had not been as a mere collection of individuals, a whole greater than the sum of its parts, unquote. In the Eucharistic liturgy, the ecclesial community eats and drinks God's love, enabling them by God's grace to offer that love in return to God, neighbor, and all of creation, the basis for justice as right relationship. Practicing Eucharistic liturgy shapes participants to become synergoi, people ever more attuned to injustice as a violation of love, people who work together with God toward restoration and healing. Desiring to trace the connections among liturgy, food, and justice further, in spring of 2011, I taught a community-based research course at Notre Dame called Synergoi, the Theological Ethics of Food Cooperatives, and I'm actually teaching that same course again now. In 2011, students directed their research efforts toward collaboration with neighbors of Monroe Park in South Bend, where our Catholic worker community is located, with the idea of starting a cooperative grocery store. Monroe Park, a majority African-American low-income area, meets the technical definition of a food desert, being located more than a mile from any full-scale grocery store. It also qualifies as a food swamp, with the local gas station providing the fast food of choice for the neighborhood's children. Local farmers are cooperating now with neighbors to bring fresh, locally grown produce to the co-op at affordable prices, and members may purchase these goods with food stamps. The farmers include members of the Amish community, and value access to a much-needed market venue for their goods, while the neighbor members are able to purchase enough produce to feed their families. Neighbor members of the co-op invest 3 hours of work a month, and one of the areas of labor involves tending the community gardens in our neighborhood. The produce from these gardens is available to everyone free of charge, and in this way the co-op as a whole hopes to extend the availability of fresh produce as much as possible, while also building neighborhood cohesion. The Monroe Park Grocery Cooperative values participation as part of justice, as the bishop's letter advocated. But like the West Oakland Food Collaborative, it seeks to cultivate a local food economy as an alternative to the global system of industrial food production and trade. If the dominant food system reifies and magnifies the very ethical concerns raised by the U.S. bishops in 1986 and decried more recently by Benedict XVI and Vandana Shiva, among others, then justice as participation ought not to reinforce that system. Rather, justice will require new practices of right relationship and exploration of creative economic alternatives like local food cooperatives. Over the longer term, the co-op membership hopes to collaborate with other grassroots efforts in the region to give shape to South Bend as a transition community, part of a movement among local communities that began in Ireland and England about a decade ago. Faced with the urgent need to scale down their level of energy consumption and to develop renewable sources of energy, transition communities around the world are exploring ways to retool, reskill, and reconnect with one another in order to build the capacity to produce locally those things that we can produce locally. And I know here in London, Ontario, you have a very active transition initiative. I believe a general meeting was just held last Saturday. The transition movement seeks to foster communities of resilience in solidarity with other local communities, reflecting the necessary connection in Catholic social thought between the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity. Subsidiarity encourages satisfaction of social needs at the most local level possible, while solidarity urges attention to the well-being of each and every member of the community, because, as Pope John Paul II put it in his 1987 encyclical letter, we are all really responsible for all. The transition movement also emphasizes the value of distributive justice considered in terms of systemic right relationship, situating socioeconomic structures within the larger framework of ecological systems. Taking seriously the warnings of Shiva and other experts, its theoretical departure point is the radical interdependence of living systems, which gives shape to the ethical imperative of human cooperation toward holistic restoration. For Christian communities, the interdependence of God's creation provides the defining context that informs human socioeconomic practices. The rightness of relationships emerges from the need for each part of creation to flourish as part of realizing the common good. Local cooperative practices directed toward food justice represent an urgent creative response to the ecological, social, and economic degradation wrought by a globalized industrial food system. These initiatives afford the opportunity for greater participation, but they also address the matrix of gender, race, and class issues as required by an understanding of justice as right relationship. Ultimately, as each part of creation thrives, it will be better able to contribute to the integrity of creation as a whole. As in Eucharistic liturgy, and for Christians through that liturgy, members of creation collaborating together as synergoi have the opportunity to notice that by living ever more deeply into the reality of interdependence, we live more fully in God's love, the ground of justice as right relationship. Thank you. I think there's plenty of time for questions and discussion. So please, and if you wouldn't mind just saying your name, Mary, thank you. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mary, I'm on board with you. I think that's one reason I find Vandana Shiva's work so attractive. Shiva is trained as a physicist, but left her work as a physicist after the Bhopal chemical disaster in India in the mid-'80s and became a full-time activist. And you can look her up on the web, but she has focused especially on trying to strengthen the institutions of Indian civil society through legislation, through the governmental structure, precisely to counter the effect of companies like Monsanto. And Monsanto is very powerful in India as well. And tragically, the suicide among Indian farmers, small peasant farmers in India, has skyrocketed because they have been coerced into buying GMO seeds and can only buy those seeds and then get into debt because the yield is small. They have to keep buying more seed. And they're ashamed to acknowledge to their families that they're in such debt. And then they end up committing suicide. Yeah. Yeah. And it isn't just. But I think what Shiva is doing is very important and hopeful because she's trying to change the laws, change the legislation within Indian society. And I think that holds promise for other civil societies like Canada and like the U.S. I think speaking as a U.S. American, one challenge that my country faces is a lack of sufficient social cohesion to challenge corporations like Monsanto. So I would love for U.S. communities to rise up in the way that Shiva is galvanizing Indians to participate and effect structural legislative change to create boundaries in Indian civil society, in Indian legislation, to keep corporations like Monsanto at bay. I think the U.S. has a much harder go of it because of our culture. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts?
Bill, I have one question, and it has to do with for the past 30 years, I've been involved in a Cold War with the Vatican on the subject of liberation theology. But what I've seen recently, actually on February the 24th, that Pope Francis, Gustavo Gutierrez, and Gerhard Mueller have got together. And to
Mm-hmm.
me, that kind of with the book that Cardinal Mueller just wrote, Poor for the Poor,
Mm-hmm.
the Mission of the Church.
Mm-hmm.
And Pope Francis has written the preface, and Gutierrez has 2 chapters in that book.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen the book, but to me, that is somewhat of an inspiration. And then with your knowledge of theology liberation, do you see any resurgence of that whole movement? And I don't mean a Marxist movement. I mean, I worked in it. It really was our bread and butter, our spiritual bread and butter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was called Teología sobre la Tierra,
Mm-hmm.
theology on the ground.
Yeah.
And it worked. But unfortunately, hierarchy and the Vatican stepped in and tramped on it.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you have any sense of where they're making, because I see it here in London,
Yeah.
liberation theology in education and in the justice
Mm-hmm.
and restorative justice. To me, for the last 30 years in education and the justice field in the court system, I found lots of areas that I could put into practice liberation theology.
Uh-huh. Can you just tell me where were you working?
I worked in the Dominican Republic,
Okay.
and then I worked in Mexico for a while, but not in I just studied in Mexico. I didn't work in, but I worked in land reform, irrigation canals,
Uh-huh.
You name it, roads,
Yeah.
labor unions, and digging out those holes.
Thank you.
That was as a Roman Catholic priest.
Okay. Well, I share your enthusiasm for recent events, and the Spirit moves as the Spirit wills. I think there have been many times in the history of the Church where maybe the institutional church is going in one direction and suddenly there's a course change. I think of Vatican II as one of those moments. And just looking at Evangelii Gaudium, how many times Pope Francis quotes documents of Vatican II, quotes from the Latin American bishops' conferences, and lifts up basic ideas coming out of liberation theology, like the preferential option for the poor. I think that these are all signs of our current times, signs of the way in which the Spirit is moving. And the meeting that you referred to is yet another one of those moments, I think. So time will tell as far as how this is disseminated in terms of the culture of the Church in particular communities around the world. I think part of it has to do with episcopal appointments that have happened over the last 30 years. I was in Chile for 2 years, the last 2 years of the Pinochet dictatorship, working with the Holy Cross Fathers there. And I saw the way in which the extent to which base communities operated and flourished and were healthy was really a function of the local bishop. And even within the Archdiocese of Santiago, a function of which parochial vicar was in charge of that area. So I think it's going to take time after 30 years of putting the damper on practices like base communities to experience a kind of resurgence. But I do think we're in a new era now with Pope Francis. So, yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
What I see happening here in London is there's lots of different groups doing lots of great things.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be a lack of cohesion among them, so sometimes the right hand doesn't, usually the right hand doesn't know what that comes to. Did you kind of start these groups kind of in isolation, or was there other things already happening in Southend, and how did those grow in the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. Annette, is that right? Well, the Catholic Worker started, and maybe most people know, but just in case, it started in New York City in 1933 when Peter Marin and Dorothy Day started writing about the works of mercy and building a a new society in the shell of the old. And in the midst of the Depression, this sounded great to people, and they were reading the newspaper, The Catholic Worker, and showing up at the doorstep and saying, where do we find this? And that's how it all got going. They started taking people in who needed a place to stay, and they saw this as practicing Matthew 25, when did I see you hungry and feed you, naked and clothe you? So in South Bend, 10 years ago, in the fall of 2003, 3 of us got together in conversation with others, many people at the local level, in local parishes, who were interested in supporting another Catholic worker community. There had been a worker community already that had sort of gradually died out, and we wanted to start something and really get it going. We also talked with other agencies in town who were already providing services, and they were very supportive. There's a lot of need in our area for shelter and for basic services for people on the street. So they didn't see it as a problem that we plan to do this. And also, our approach is very grassroots. We're not institutionalized. We have no paid staff. We don't get any government funding. It's all run by private donations. And so we didn't, in terms of turf, we weren't really encroaching on anyone's turf. We did have one issue with zoning in our neighborhood. We discovered that the house that we chose was actually zoned for single families. And a family in South Bend is defined as no more than 2 people unrelated to each other can live in a house. So we had to go before the city council. It was actually a very painful public battle, and ask for a change in the zoning, and we lost by 1 vote. But we tried to make the argument that we're all related as brothers and sisters in Christ. But when I said that before the city council, they accused me of proselytizing. So I thought, well, I guess that didn't go over so well. But we ended up having to move, and we have been in our current location for the last, since the spring of 2006, and we're able to open the drop-in center later that year. And so we work very collaboratively with the other groups who are much better funded and much bigger organizations and are definitely institutionalized. So they, I think they try to be helpful to us where they're able, and that's mutual from our side, although we don't have as much to offer them. I don't know if that answers your question. I think one thing is we also have a monthly meeting. All the agencies that provide weather amnesty, it's called the Continuum of Care. And so we stay in touch with each other, and when there's an issue, we communicate about it, and that's been very helpful. Yeah.
Cooperatives, sustainability, access to resources, in terms of your Native American or Indian populations that are supported. I know it's certainly a big issue for us up here right now in terms of working for justice for our First Nations peoples.
Yeah.
We spent wondering, from your end, when it comes to the projects to your end, if work is developing in that area as well.
Yeah, more work needs to be done in that area. There is a good edited collection that just came out in the past couple of years called Race, Class, and Food Justice and Sustainability, involving race and class. And it's edited by Alison Alcon. I referred to her in this essay. And Julian Aigayaman is the other co-editor. And in that volume, they focus specifically on low-income communities of color, and there are some case studies involving indigenous communities in the U.S., but more work needs to be focused in that way. In the volume, there's an article by Teresa Mares and Alfonso Peña, and they write about this concept of food sovereignty that I mentioned. And they focus on indigenous communities in part of their essay. So that idea of food sovereignty is the place where more work needs to be done. So for communities to be self-organizing and to claim autonomy, not in an individualistic sense, but in a sense of claiming their own communal identity as something separate from the dominant system. So not even so much going up against in direct resistance of the dominant system, but creating this separate space, this other way of being autonomously. That's the area where much more work needs to be done.
I go with a group of students every summer up to a First Nations community. It would be about a 7 or 8 hour flight north of Fargo. It's far. It's really common to see little kids walking around with bags of potato chips and cans of Coke.
Yeah.
And I remember being so anxious about it. And then you walk into what's there as kind of a quote-unquote grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
And it's $18 for a liter of milk, and an orange is $2.50.
Yeah.
And we've done so much kind of colonizing to strip from them an ability to be engaged with itself. And it's going to be generations to bring back. Are you aware of any programs in the U.S. that are seeking to assist Aboriginal communities in kind of reclaiming either the ability to return to natural practice of hunting or agriculture, tending fields, water crops?
I'm aware of particular communities that are doing that for themselves, but not so much programs. Precisely because of this issue of food sovereignty. I think it really needs to come from the community itself. And that is a long road when a community has been so decimated in terms of its own cultural identity. But there are examples, and I could send you some resources. I think especially around where you see this happening probably more prominently than with food is in the area of nuclear waste. So indigenous communities that have galvanized their sense of solidarity and justice around saying no to becoming a site for large-scale dumping of nuclear waste. And there are a couple of great books about that I could refer you to that speak to that. Other thoughts? Is anybody part of the transition movement here in London, Ontario? Or a food co-op? I know that the cooperatives around here are very active. Yeah. So, yeah, please. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a cooperative association meeting coming up at the end of March. At least that's what I saw on the web. But yeah. Sure, yeah. Yeah, it made me want to live here. I thought, boy, there's a lot going on around here. Yeah.
I think there's going to be a challenge here in the future with what's happened to the manufacturing sector in this region. And now there's talk at the top thing of South Korea refuses to use cars, use Margaret, and that's going to be reused for some sort of an agricultural stem cell curing program.
Hmm.
And I think it's very interesting to think of what sort of place that's going to be and on what kind of values it's going to be built on, whether it's going to be sort of industrial side farming or because they want to capitalize here on what the person before me said, the fact that this is just a wonderful agricultural region. And I just think it's going to be a challenge to watch and see, maybe participate in what kind of shape this takes in our future.
Thanks for saying that last part about participating. I was waiting for that. Yeah.
Haven't heard much. I mean, it seems to be spoken of more in terms of, oh, it's going to provide jobs for people in the region, it's going to make use of our rich agricultural land. But what shape will it take? I wonder. Does anybody here know anything about that?
Anybody? Doesn't.
We're actually talking about using most of the plants as greenhouse, as a common greenhouse. Are they? So they'll actually be producing some stuff there. There's people in places over there about 200 kilometers south of the railway line that they need access to those railways for distribution.
I just would encourage you, if you feel drawn to that issue and you're aware of the potential, but also the potential downsides if it isn't used well, maybe that's a call to participate and really exercise your voice and agency to find out what's happening and to help shape that vision. That's what the transition movement is all about. So that might be a place to check too. The folks involved in transition in London, Ontario might already be involved in generating ideas, like turning it into a greenhouse. But one thing for sure is if we as citizens don't follow that little nudge, gee, I wonder what they're going to do with that space, and I hope it's not going in the wrong direction. If we don't follow that kind of nudge that we feel interiorly, we're ceding our food sovereignty to the interests of larger corporations and a kind of dominant market economy. So I would just urge you to really follow that intuition that you have, and others too. Any other questions? Oh, please.
Not exactly a question, but I know some people who are going to try to pressure city council to ban, I think it's what's called nixtamales that affect the honeybees.
Okay.
Because you can't have a lot of fruit if you don't have honeybees to pollinate. And that's going to contain chemicals and pesticides and herbicides. I guess when that issue comes, people can call the city council and
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And I don't know what the cultural practice is, but do ordinary people show up at city council meetings to participate? That would be great. They can be fun. Yeah, yeah. So, well, thanks a lot for coming tonight. I appreciate being with you.
I had the pleasure of spending some time with Margaret this evening before the lecture, and I trust that in your experience of her this evening, you will have been able to see the genuineness with which Margaret lives out these values, and I had the opportunity to hear a little bit more about that in terms of her lived experience with the Catholic worker community in South Bend that she's alluded to tonight. So I just want to say that I appreciate, Margaret, you highlighting for us the systemic injustices of race, gender, and class, and the connection with access to healthy and affordable food sources. An important reminder that we are truly God's co-workers in this interdependent relationship of God's creation, that the violation of any one part jeopardizes the well-being of the whole. Thank you for challenging us to think about how we can think and act differently in a way that doesn't participate in the mega total economy of ignorance, that we can be people of synagogue. Thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on Thursday the 27th for our final lecture of this series of 2013-14, I should say, which will be, in fact, a musical performance. If you'd like more information, we have pamphlets out at the table. Thanks again.